So for step 11, attaching the motor mount, we need the mount itself, we need this motor plate, and we need the motor. Well, there is the motor, there is the motor plate, and under normal circumstances, you'd grab this off of parts tree D. However, if you recall, we are doing a hop-up and putting in the aluminum motor mount. Now, what's interesting is on the back, you can see aluminum mount offers precision and durability, reduces power loss due to more secure motor attachment, and boosts heat dissipation. Now, I know when I was reading about this, one of the things that it talked about was the flex. The aluminum is so much more solid, so there was a much better efficiency of power transfer from the motor to the gearbox. So I'm curious to see how that works. So that is what we are going to be replacing that plastic part with. So I'll just empty this, get it all set, and we will attach this aluminum motor mount. Okay, so I have everything out, ready to go. We've got our motor mount, we've got the motor plate, and then of course we've got the motor. But the one thing to watch out for is here, because you can see that there's a whole bunch of numbers. Now on this one, you can see the 22, it even can be flipped around and has some of the smaller numbers. But this is to do with pinion gear size. So the pinion that the kit comes with is a 22 tooth. But if you changed it, you would have to turn the motor depending on what size pinion you have. So we're going to do the stock setup. So we're going to put this on, then the motor plate, then the motor. And the other thing to make note of is these diagrams are there for a reason. That marking is going to show it like that. You don't want to be putting it in with this hole because these markings are not there. It has to be on the other side. So you want to make sure that in terms of placement, you're putting it on exactly as shown. So I'm just going to do this off camera because it's just these, the motor mount, the plate, and the motor. I'm just going to put them together and then we'll come back. So there is the finished step 11. You can see that the screws are in line with the 22 tooth pinion, and it just looks like that. So that is now finished. So we can now move on to step 12, which is attaching the motor. So we're first going to put the pinion on, and you can see by the diagram they want this to be exactly at the 10 millimeter mark from the edge of the motor plate to the end of the pinion. And then we're going to put this into the chassis, and then there's the cover as well, plus the body mounts. So I've got everything we need together here, and here is the motor pinion cover and gear cover for the rear, and then we've got our body mounts. So first, I think what we're going to do is let's get the pinion on the motor, and then we can install this into the chassis. So first, let's get the pinion onto the motor, and I've shown you this before, but what I like to do is get the pinion into the hole first, and I don't screw it all the way in, but I just want to make sure that it's in. And then when we grab the motor, I want to first get it onto the lip so that it doesn't turn. Because then it's stuck on that one spot, so it just helps with making sure that it's going to be in the right place. So if we look at how this is supposed to fit, you can see that it's pretty much right at the end. So the end of the pinion gear is pretty much where the end of the notch is on here. So I'll have to do this off camera because it's hard to see from here, but I'm just gonna make sure that the end of the pinion is at the end of where the flat spot starts and ends, and then I'll screw it in. So I'll just go ahead and do that, and we'll move on to installing it in the chassis. Okay, so I've put the pinion gear on exactly where it needs to be. And if you measure this out, and it's supposed to be 10 millimeters from the end of the motor plate. And as you can see, that is exactly 10 millimeters. But I didn't do it the way I thought I was going to do it, because as you can see here, it shows that the pinion gear, the end of it fits at the very end of the flat spot of what's coming out of the motor. And as you can see inside there, that is not the case. It's actually quite a bit farther out. Well, on a TT-02 chassis, there is a bonus to the way you build this, because the gear is fully exposed. So what I did was I put this in place, and I put the pinion gear into the center of the spur gear and then started to tighten it down. Because now that's actually in the perfect center of the spur gear, so that you know it's exactly where it should be. You want that. So I did it that way. So I think what you'll find is with this kit, if you're going to do this, put the pinion gear on, tighten it up a bit, but put it actually into place, and then see how that's fitting on the spur gear, and then tighten it down. Because I think you'll find that's the easiest way to know that you've got the pinion in the right place. So I just discovered something that you're going to need to be aware of. And I almost made this mistake because something just didn't feel right. As you can see, you put the motor plate into the chassis, and then you're going to use these MA2 screws to screw it in. However, because we have the aluminum motor mount hop-up, you'll notice here on step 11 we used it, and it came with 2 of these MA4 screws. So I put them in here to attach them to the motor. Then when you come over to here, and we've put the pinion in, we're doing everything we need to install it, it shows the MA2 screws. But that is not correct. Because this is an aluminum motor mount, you want the MA4 screws. So the MA4 screws that they're referring to right here actually came with the kit. They're right there. Those would have been the screws you should have used. I used the ones that came with the hop-up aluminum mount. So now in moving over to step 12 and that we're ready to install it in the chassis, these 2 MA2 screws should be the MA4 screws that came with the aluminum motor mount, which I'll now take out of this bag to screw it in. So again, when you're installing an aluminum motor mount, make sure that these are the screws that it came with, because this is not meant to be used with tapping screws. So I'll just get it all set up and we'll screw this into the chassis. Okay, so let's install the motor. So first of all, we're gonna get that into there. It's in place. Turn this over, and we're going to use these MA4 screws to screw this into place. And you'll notice a big difference because they actually feel like they're going into the motor mount. So if you've forgotten to do this and you start putting in the tapping screws that they're suggesting if you didn't have the motor mount, I'm sure you're gonna wreck something. So just make sure that if you get resistance, just know you're probably using the wrong screws. And the other thing to be aware of is that if you aren't using the hop-up and you're using the plastic one is quite soft. So if you over tighten, you're going to have a loose motor mount which probably isn't going to do your gears, motor, or anything else any good. So just be aware that if you don't use the aluminum motor mount, there is the possibility of stripping it. I know this because on my Gazoo Racing TT-02, I did over tighten, thinking it wasn't tight enough, and in fact I was already starting to strip it. So I had to try and figure something out to make this tighter. Now with the aluminum motor mount, and as far as I can see, I would strongly suggest getting this rather than relying on the plastic. When you're tightening this up, there's no question whether it's tight or not. It's solid. So now that is completely in, we can move on to doing the cover and moving on to the next part, which is installing the body mounts right here. Okay, so it's time for the next step, which is to put this cover over top, which is pretty simple enough. Just going to put it down, and then we're going to just start screwing it in place. I'll just put in a couple like this. I'm not going to show the whole thing because, you know, obviously this is pretty self-explanatory. Because there's 5 of them all the way around. And again, I'm kind of just getting them all started just to make sure that there's no binding or anything. Going in, and then the final one. Yeah, so I'm just going to screw in those 5 screws, and we'll come back and put in the body mounts. So all the screws are in now, nice and tight, so we can move on to putting in the body mounts. So as you can see, the way that is shaped, you want to make sure that that's facing more inward. And you can see that even though this is a circle, you can see that it's sort of a square notching on the peg itself. It's kind of hard to see, but there is a square section of the peg. So if I put that in there, it's not going to go, there we go, until it's at the right position. And you can see that it's supposed to be angled to the left, so I've angled that to the left. So now we're just going to need to screw those in, and these are back to the MA2 tapping screws. That should be down. And then same thing on the other side. You can see that it's angled the other way. So we're going to put that in that way so that it sits like that. And we're going to screw that one in as well. And there we go. So now I said the body mounts, but I mean the battery box mounts. So they are now in place, and we can now move on to step 13, which is attaching the rear lower arms.